Welcome to everyone who's just joining us in the audience. I'm going to give us about another minute or so to let a few more people have a chance to join us, and then I will go ahead and get things started. Okay, so welcome everyone, everyone in the audience and our two panelists for today. My name is Rebecca Tromble. I am the Associate Director for the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. Before we jump into the panel, I want to take just a minute for those new to IDDP to share just a little bit with you about the Institute and about our mission. We are a new institute that was founded just last fall with the mission to help members of the public, help journalists, help policymakers really around the world better understand through research digital media's influence on public dialogue, on opinion, on society, on democracy as a whole. And we also work in the policy space to try to develop sound solutions to disinformation and other online harms. The Institute was founded, as I said, in the fall with a generous gift from the Knight Foundation, and we're part of the larger network of research institutions that are doing similar work on disinformation and other online harm concerns. And in fact, the two scholars joining us here today, Daniel is actually part of one of these institutes, and Shannon will shortly be joining the same institute. So without further ado, let me actually officially introduce the two of them. You're joining us today for part of IDDP's Summer Spotlight webinar series. And today's topic is Arbiters of Truth, Platform Content Policies and the US Elections. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome colleagues and friends, Shannon McGregor and Daniel Crease. Shannon is currently at the University of Utah, but will soon be joining Daniel at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Now, before I turn it over to them with the first question, I want to set up our conversation today with just a little bit of background context. I think most people in the audience will be well aware of the fact that there's been no shortage of controversy around some of President Donald Trump's recent tweets. And these tweets have really brought to our attention, to the public's attention, to policymakers and to academics' attention, all sorts of questions about what platforms' policies are towards content moderation in the lead up to the US elections, and how they might treat public officials, including the President of the United States himself, in ways different from average users. So of course, on May 26th, just about a month ago, Donald Trump tweeted, "There is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent." And went on, right, to talk about the governor of California sending ballots to millions of people, to absolutely anyone, he says. You notice at the bottom of this tweet that there's a little exclamation point with a note to get the facts about mail-in ballots. Now, of course, that's not something that Donald Trump himself tweeted. It's something that Twitter, an intervention that Twitter added after the fact. It's essentially a fact check that they inserted into his tweet. Well, in response to that, on May 28th, Donald Trump issued his executive order on preventing online censorship, which among other things discussed the possibility of undermining or reducing the protections that platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube have under Section 230. The day after he issued that executive order, he was tweeting again, and Twitter was intervening yet again, this time on the basis of their policies related to glorification of violence. So this is the infamous "when the looting starts, the shooting starts" tweet. And here, right, I'm actually showing the full tweet, but if you go to this tweet on Twitter at the moment, you'll see that it's actually fully masked, and that all of the retweets and likes that are associated with it have been removed. And yet, right, Twitter did show that it was willing to intervene in these two instances, and yet we see this tweet from just yesterday. Rigged 2020 election, millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and others. It will be the scandal of our times. There were a couple of other tweets very similar to this that he issued on the same day, and Twitter has now said publicly that they will not intervene, will not put a fact check or otherwise intervene on any of these tweets, which has led people to naturally have a bit of skepticism, or certainly a lot of questions about the platform's policies in these areas. So with that as context, with that as background, I want to turn it over to Daniel and to Shannon to tell us a little bit more. Daniel, if we could start with you. I know that in particular in recent months, you and some of your colleagues have been issuing quite a few publications really reflecting on content policies from the platforms, and that especially as of yesterday, you've expressed quite a bit of skepticism about how Twitter is handling this. So I wonder if you could start us off by sort of giving us the bigger picture here, contextualizing these particular tweets and helping us understand how they reflect the larger landscape of content moderation policies ahead of the US elections. Sorry, Daniel, you're actually muted at the moment.
There we go. So I run the Digital Politics project at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, and we've really spent the last year digging into the content moderation policies and platforms in specific political contexts. So all the major platforms have broader terms of service, community standards, et cetera, that more or less apply to politics. But we're particularly interested in is what are the policies that are most likely going to affect political speech, and what should they be? So generally working with our lead researcher, Bridget Barrett, who is in the Husband School of Journalism and Media, we determined that there are four broad categories where platforms seem very willing to step in and moderate content in specific contexts. The first concerns false information about democratic processes. These are the election tweets that you just talked about, Rebecca. Broadly, these policies, and they look different across different platforms, but they concern the process and procedures of voting in particular ways, and they're specifically worded to attempt to combat things that might make it less likely for people to actually vote. The second category of information generally concerns manipulated media. So this is things like the Nancy Pelosi video that was edited. And in this context, most platforms have rules against this, in part because there's an original that can be checked against something that's been manipulated in a particular way. A third area concerns tragic events, so things like denial of the Holocaust, for instance. And the fourth broadly concerns health information. And this is increasingly taken on political valence because there are a lot of political issues associated with things like the governmental response to COVID-19. All of which is to say that every one of the major platforms moderate political truth in particular ways, shapes, or forms, although the way that they do so is different across platform. We can get more into that, but we issued a whole report that looked and compared them side by side. Most platforms too treat certain categories of users differently than others. In general, companies like Facebook and Twitter have a newsworthiness or public interest exemption on certain types of content, so that they're going to treat those accounts differently, in part given that inherent claim that voters should see what those vying for public office are actually saying. So in the example that you presented today, for instance, what Twitter says is that they will put the problematic words that have been fact-checked of elected officials, for instance, like President Trump, behind a disclaimer, or they'll fact-check it, not take it down. They might limit its reach, they might limit your ability to retweet it or like it, but they're not going to take it down, in part because Twitter argues it's important that voters can see what those vying for office are doing. Facebook has a carve out where they say that world leaders, for instance, are not subject to fact checking, so that they're protected from that. However, and this is where I think is a jumping off point for the context of electoral misinformation, Facebook actually says that elected officials and world leaders are subject to their election misinformation policies. So that even though they're not going to be fact checked, they're still subject to these policies, which means Facebook itself is going to adjudicate what is true or what is false in the context of an election.
Janet, do you mind sort of jumping off of that last point that Daniel was sharing and reflecting a bit more for us about how the platforms have sort of positioned themselves as, well, you know, Mark Zuckerberg has said they don't want to be arbiters of truth, yet in these particular contexts and removing fact checkers, how they have ultimately positioned themselves within these kind of electoral environments.
Sure, yeah. Also, thanks for hosting this and inviting us. I'm already enjoying the conversation. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we continue to see is that these companies say they don't want to be arbiters of truth. Facebook in particular has said that. And yet, of course, I think Daniel put it really nicely when he was talking about this. They absolutely are shaping our political truth, right? And sort of what things look like. You know, there are many more people subscribing, you know, or following certain politicians on Facebook than potentially subscribing to the New York Times or watching NBC News every night, right? So the potential of this information, you know, to just reach more people is there, and when they're not adjudicating it, you know, even according to their own policies, you know, we've seen their struggle with this, and these continue to carve out these sort of loopholes, like we saw around those same tweets that you brought up that, for example, Twitter did take action on. Those were also reposted on Donald Trump's Facebook and violated very similar guidelines that Facebook has, yet Facebook decided not to do anything about that, right? And I think what's hard in the context in particular of misinformation about voting processes in our election and sort of these democratic things is that, you know, I can be sympathetic to the idea that we should hear what our leaders are saying, right? And so if the president of the United States is going to lie, then that's information that like voters maybe should have, right? And there's, you know, some fact checking about that. I can be sympathetic to that standpoint, but if that's the only information, or if that's the dominant source of information and it's false about how people are going to be able to vote, then we really worry about that. But I think you know, to bring it up one level, I think the biggest problem about it is that it is Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey making these decisions about what political information people are able to get on these different platforms. And I don't think that represents any democratic process at all, right? That we might feel comfortable with. Having the sole decision maker rest in the hands of, you know, some white guy who started a tech company.
Right. Daniel, you had mentioned earlier when you were sort of going through the list of these policies, laying that out for us. You had mentioned that one of the policies, and obviously one that's particularly relevant to our topic today, the electoral environment, is to intervene with content that makes people less likely to vote. I mean, this points to concerns that the platforms may have about voter suppression. So I'll put it to both of you, right? What do you see as the platform's policies around voter suppression? And are they in line with what we know about the actual tactics that are used to suppress the vote?
Great. So maybe I can start, Shannon, and then you can jump in. First of all, I will say that broadly, all the major platforms have policies that are on the books that are pretty consistent on this point, that whether you're a world leader or an average user, the idea of circulating misinformation or disinformation about things like the processes, the procedures of voting, should not have a place or be respected on these particular platforms. And I think that's the right call. Look, I don't think it would be controversial to say that at a bare minimum, politicians or those vying for office shouldn't be able to undermine accountability at the ballot box, right? And in essence, I think this cuts the heart of the president's tweets. He is seeking to undermine the only process the public has to hold him accountable for his time in office. And I think it's not controversial for platforms to step in and say, this is low value political speech. These are claims that are deliberately misleading about who might receive mail-in ballots, about how they're going to be counted, about whether they're going to be fraudulent or not. And this cuts to the very heart of the democratic system. And I think the empirical research bears this out. So there was a study that was released a few days ago that showed just how difficult it is, if not impossible it is, to correct misinformation about electoral context that comes from political elites, such as candidates, because everyone wants to believe in their own team, right? So all the platforms have these policies on the books. The problem, and I think this is what Shannon was talking about earlier, is that the enforcement is whimsical at best, right? So all the major platforms want to maintain as much interpretive flexibility as possible in order to interpret those policies as they wish and then apply them to particular cases. The challenge is that we've seen time and time and time again that companies like Facebook will enforce its rules clearly if you're not powerful. So if you're a run-of-the-mill actor, or even if you're a congressional candidate and are engaging in circulating mis or disinformation. But if you're the president of the United States, you're going to be untouchable if you're Facebook. Facebook maintains one set of policies that are actually enforced for everyone, and then a different set of policies that they interpret in various ways if they don't want to take any action at all. And oftentimes they don't take action when it comes to those who are most powerful. I think this is exactly what we saw in the Trump case. In other cases, I think what we see is just a mind-boggling way that platforms fail to interpret their own policies in ways that reasonable people would. So Twitter's actual civic integrity policy says that you are not allowed to engage in misleading claims, this is a direct quote, about processes, procedures, or techniques which could dissuade people from participating. Now, I don't know how you could read the president's tweets that you just had up there from yesterday in any way other than to say that that will make people less likely to engage in mail-in voting, right? And in fact, 5 states are only vote by mail. So how that doesn't apply. So how that doesn't dissuade people from voting. And then I think, and this cuts the heart of Shannon's point earlier on, what a Twitter spokesman said yesterday in response to that, like, look, this isn't eligible for a fact check because it's not state specific. But as a ProPublica reporter pointed out yesterday, Trump made a very set of specific claims that actually applied to all states and all absentee and mail-in voting writ large. And how that doesn't run counter to Twitter's very own policy is frankly just mind-boggling. So again, these are rules that are on the books, they're whimsically enforced, they're flexibly interpreted, all of which means that the public has little guarantee that platform companies are going to do things to safeguard democratic elections. And look, I should say I have a lot of sympathy for these companies. I think in a functioning political system, Republican Party elites would be the ones that are out there to say what the president is saying is wrong. We have a robust electoral system. We have secretaries of states and boards of elections that are responsible for upholding the integrity of the process. And in general, it works well. I think in an ideal world, in a properly functioning world, Republicans would be engaged in settling those political issues for themselves, but they're not. So in that context, we have to look to platforms to play this role, and this is something that they're clearly failing at doing.
Shannon, before you add to that, I realized that I made a mistake at the top here, in that I didn't actually encourage our participants to submit questions for the discussion. So I just want to take a quick second here to really encourage the attendees, the members of the audience, to submit questions using the Q&A function. I will monitor those and throw your questions as appropriate to our panelists here today. So sorry about that, Shannon, over to you.
No, that's great. I mean, yes, like echo and agree with everything you said, Daniel. And I think there's another layer to all of this, which is thinking about the point of view of the people at these platform companies who are making these decisions, right? So if you are a person who is working on the politics or policy teams at Facebook or Twitter, you know a lot about politics, right? And so to you, maybe looking at a tweet that has this outrageous claim about mail-in ballots doesn't even seem dangerous, right? Because you have the information and you have the background to understand like that this is on its face absurd. And I think that point of view is problematic, right? Because that's a pretty privileged point of view to say that this might not be a problem. You know, you asked a minute ago, Rebecca, about like what might voter suppression look like, you know, and are these policies laid out to fix it? As I think yesterday's example shows, this is a very clear-cut case, the most obvious case of like voter suppression, right? That is not, and misinformation about the electoral process, and it's still not being adjudicated. The voter suppression that we saw in 2016, that Youngmi Kim at the University of Wisconsin and her team showed, was insidious, race-based, implicit, you know, forms of voter suppression. That specifically targeted, in the case that she looked at, Black Americans. And so if these on its face across the board attempts at voter suppression and misinformation are not adjudicated with clear violations to policies, then how can we expect these platforms to be able to do so when the attempts at voter suppression are more insidious, when they are even more around a more politically sensitive topic and highly salient topic like race in our country at this moment? And so, the case of yesterday just makes me have even less faith, which I wasn't sure was possible, but it turns out it is, than previously that these platforms are going to be able to step in and do anything. Because as Daniel pointed out, in a functioning system, not only would we maybe have Republican leaders, you know, leaders of the party coming out and correcting this, but we might even have a government that had some regulations, you know, around this sorts of political information. But we're not, right? And so instead we're relying on these platforms. And I think the example yesterday shows that there's no way that they're going to be adjudicating these things well, especially in these more, what I suspect we'll see even more insidious and race-based and sex-based and gender-based types of voter suppression to come in the next few months.
So we just had a question come in from the audience that is I think really well timed, something that I was going to ask about myself. It's directed to you, Shannon, specifically, but I think, Shannon, if you'd start us off, and then Daniel, I think it would be really good to get your thoughts on this as well. So the question starts off by saying, you mentioned that the policy enforcement mechanisms at tech companies are undemocratic. Would you comment on whether you can imagine a more democratic process for decision-making by social media platforms and what that might actually look like?
Sure. I mean, I think they're undemocratic if it's just like one person deciding something, right? And so something that might look closer to that, I think, is even the example that we have that's existing, which is Facebook has constituted this oversight board. Now, it's not small d democratic in that these people weren't elected, but you imagine they might be publicly accountable, right, for the decisions that come down in a way that's much more sort of transparent than one man at a company making the decision. So I think we even have an example of that, but so far that hasn't been rolled out. It doesn't, there's some sort of disagreement or consternation around whether, in this case, whether the Facebook Oversight Board would review things that are up or only things that have been taken down, right? And so the processes around it are really unclear. But I also think another version of it might be, and Daniel and I have talked about this before in some of our work, it's just a role for more public voice, where we have seen in this process. So where we have seen, these tech companies change their decisions or make different decisions is in response to public pressure, right? So the press, the public being upset about something, that's when we've seen that some of these decisions have been walked back or changed. And so room for more public voice around this. There are lots of different processes about what that could look like. Is there a feedback mechanism? Is there polling? Is there a way for there to be some community sort of involvement in it? I don't mean community like adjudicating the post, but having some sort of role for the public voice in this in a more institutionalized manner, rather than what it looks like right now, which is people who are following politics closely, maybe on Twitter, blow something up, then it of course becomes covered by the press, and that's sort of the way it happens, but that in and of itself is not necessarily a very democratic process at all.
Yeah, so I have, I guess, a few thoughts on sort of what procedures we need, right? So democracy is in part about creating fairness, right? So that people are treated equally under the law, or in this context, under program policies more generally, and that they're ultimately safeguarding other public institutions. And I think that's key. Mm-hmm. So I would say sort of a few things that are necessary in this context. The first is clear policies, right? So they have to be clear and they have to be made public, so that we should know what are the policies that govern speech in the context of politics in the US and countries around the world. Second, I would say that because we are also dealing with a normative expectation of freedom of speech, we need narrowly defined policies in the context of elections, the census, and health. I don't think that Facebook should adjudicate much broader political truths, such as when politicians are lying or not. What I do think they can, however, is step in some very clear and very narrow contexts where there is good, independent, and authoritative information. This is in the context of elections. Again, we have institutions that are required by law to secure the integrity of the vote, such as state secretaries of state, such as boards of elections. They should be given a platform and treated authoritatively in the context of content moderation decisions. Second, the census, right? If elections concern short-term political power, the census concerns long-term political power. Mm-hmm. It's how congressional seats get allocated, for instance. It's how public services get allocated. This is another place where platforms should step in and very clearly encourage participation in the census and fight disinformation. And finally, health. I think there's a very strong and compelling interest, particularly in the context of harm, for why health is also important. Number three, I think that anything that platforms do should emphasize counter speech. This is where I think Twitter gets it right? So they didn't take the Trump tweets down. What they did is they met speech with counter speech. They flagged that speech, they fact checked it, they sent users to outside resources, and they limited the platform and the reach that ultimately it could get. So they said, look, we don't respect this speech. It runs counter to our own values as a company. We believe that it's dangerous. We're not going to take it down. We understand that it's important that the president has a voice on our platform. However, we are going to clearly mark and say why we don't believe that this speech is accurate and that we therefore don't respect it, right? So they put it behind a disclaimer and they limit its amplification. I think that's the right approach. There's nothing more democratic than encouraging counter speech. And in fact, all of these platform companies enjoy an expressive right under the First Amendment to be able to moderate content and engage in counter speech as they wish. The First Amendment protects Twitter from Trump, not the other way around. So I think that they met it right. And I think more broadly, remedies that emphasize counter speech should be encouraged. Number four, there needs to be clear and transparent procedures, right? This goes into that interpretive flexibility that I mentioned early on. So how is it that these companies rule? What is the rationale? And they should be expected to provide rationales that reasonable people would also agree on. And there should be a public justification for it. Number 5, fair and equal enforcement. And I think this cuts the heart of where we started off with Facebook, right? If Facebook has one set of rules for Donald Trump and another set of rules for congressional candidates, that's a problem. If Facebook has one set of rules for Donald Trump and another set of rules for average everyday citizens, that's a problem. Donald Trump should not get a carve out based on the office that he holds, and it's particularly dangerous given that he's undermining the vote for his own office, his own accountability. There should be a public justification and an appeals process. I would limit the public's involvement. I don't think the public broadly should be adjudicating every one of these instances. I think there's all sorts of ways these decisions can be gamed. However, there should be a public justification where stakeholders in the process have an opportunity to weigh in on those decisions, and there should be an appeals process for people who are affected. And finally, consistency, right? Once decisions get made, I think that platforms have a responsibility to adhere to them. This means no backtracking in the wake of political pressure, so that when Donald Trump threatens Twitter with Section 230, they should stick by their guns. In fact, they have an obligation to stick by their guns, particularly given the stakes here are democratic elections itself.
So I wonder, sort of picking up on the last point about the obligation to consistency and not being intimidated, but also feeding into this idea of different standards for different types of actors, and particularly this kind of escape clause that you've both mentioned around the newsworthiness of particular content and making exceptions around newsworthiness. My question is perhaps going to come across a little bit cynical, which is maybe warranted or not. In fact, I think my question for you is the cynicism warranted? How much of this leeway, how many of these loopholes, how much of this broad interpretability that allows the platforms to make exceptions for particularly powerful actors, how much of that do you think is driven by the bottom line? You both have done really excellent work on the platform's actual interventions and direct work with different campaigns in the past. Do you think that there's a concern within the companies that their interventions are going to ultimately harm the bottom line and the sort of money that they get from the campaigns themselves?
Yeah, and I would, I guess I'll just make it more cynical, is that because I think there's a bottom line part of it in terms of like the money that comes in from political advertising, but I don't think that's the bottom line. The bottom line is about regulation, right? And that's, I think, where it's about, is making sure, in implicit or explicit ways, and people have told us this, that relationships are part of it, right? And making sure that, the people who are in elected office, who are in a position to regulate these companies in any sense, have a good relationship with them, right? And that they have a positive sense of Facebook and of Twitter and of Google, because then they're less likely to be regulated, or they're more likely to be, have an open or sympathetic ear to the company when they come back with some claim against regulation. So I would just double down on the cynicism in that sense, and that I don't think it's about the direct political advertising dollars, because it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money compared to the money Facebook brings in general about advertising, right? I think it's more about the regulation that may or may not be coming, and maintaining what Facebook and Google and Twitter see as favorable relationships with those who will be in a position to regulate them at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Shannon's exactly right. I think that what's going on here is a really set of very salient considerations about the regulatory context that these companies face themselves in, as well as, maybe advertising revenue, but I think more broadly, they're very sensitive to political pressure for all sorts of reasons that these public companies would be, in part changing that regulatory context that they operate in. I think will affect them not only in the near term, but in the long term in terms of their revenue streams in the years to come. Then again, I mean, I will say, I do think that there's other competing interests at play. I think that there is a deep value for free speech that exists, particularly within Silicon Valley. It has its historical and cultural roots, and I do think it's a deeply held value for all sorts of reasons. So I think that plays an important role. At the same time, is that I think that Facebook and Twitter, like all companies right now, are trapped in the middle of a rising tide of polarization on both sides. And that a lot of the arguments that we have over things like speech and content moderation are actually displaced political arguments that take place around platforms, because it's a lot easier to have a conversation about Facebook and Twitter than it is to talk about something like racism or sexism or a slide into, authoritarianism or the weakening of democratic systems and the like. So I think a lot of what these companies are having to do is figure out what is their role when companies are being forced to express their values and live their values in ways, because this is the expectation that their users have. And it's the expectations, that their shareholders and their employees have. And I think you see this in a very big way. Yeah. And this is why I think the Facebook walkouts of recent weeks in response to the failure to act on Trump's looting and shooting posts on Facebook starts to take on newfound significance, is that bottom lines are not just about regulation and the threat of regulation or political advertising dollars. It's also about keeping your employees, particularly in a deeply expert and specialized labor force like people who are engineers at Facebook. So you have to now start to navigate with them in mind too. I think that's a really positive development to see more pressure exerted from within these companies to try to hold them accountable to their own stated values, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the irony here, is that these companies sort of have long sort of set their own community standards that are a framework for how they're going to be run as businesses, in part given their own commercial concerns, right? No family wants to use a site that's rampant in neo-Nazi propaganda, right? So Facebook quite sensibly has a set of community standards that is in part driven by a set of commercial concerns. I would only advocate that Facebook and Twitter should go farther and run their businesses more in line with their commercial interests. And in part, those commercial interests that come from user expectations about what sorts of sites they want to act and be within. And they have every right to do so, because ultimately it's a private property right. They can run those businesses the way they want to. And I think that's an important thing to recommend. I do find it ironic that, those who would argue for, platforms having to be governed in a way that accords with the First Amendment, for instance, particularly on the right, would also then deny Facebook and Twitter a property right to say that they should run their businesses right the way that they see fit. So I think there's a complicated set of concerns that sort of underlie the surface here.
You've both talked at multiple points this afternoon about the need for more accountability and responsiveness to the general public, to users much more broadly. But you've also highlighted the kind of incredible power that the executives in particular at these companies have. And one of the questions that we have from the audience is simply whether you think there's any historical parallel for this. Has there really ever been someone in the media or in the business that you think has had such a high level of influence on the dissemination of information? Or are we really in a completely unique timeline, basically?
Shannon, do you want to start?
I mean, I can start only to say, as not a student of history necessarily, but certainly questions of media power and conglomeration and consolidation have been issues that have been at the forefront of our field. When I started my master's degree in 2006, that was where my research interests were at the sort of consolidation of news organizations and worried about that from sort of a democratic standpoint, right? Like the USA Today effect. As we recall, that was our concern, I feel like, in the early 2000s. And so is it a direct parallel to having one person maybe making a decision? I don't think so. But I think these concerns about private corporations having, a control over what our political landscape looks like is not new, right? I think what's different in this particular case is that even in those cases, when we think about like consolidation of the press, there is still this sense that the press is sort of the fourth estate, right? And that they have this, deep normative value to democracy itself. I don't think that Silicon Valley has that. I don't think that tech firms necessarily have that. It's not been enshrined. It definitely doesn't have the same like history. And so I think that to my eyes, is like one of the biggest differences. Not necessarily that the concern of one person or one corporation having control is not a new concern, but sort of the different normative underlying values of the role of technology firms vis-a-vis the press itself in being the providers of political information.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Shannon said. I mean, I think one of the challenges is to really think through, like, what is the nature of the power of platforms, really, right? Do they look more powerful than in previous eras, a very strong, media monopoly, and, most newspapers, for instance, or television stations or radio stations being owned by large-scale conglomerates, right? In a pre-social media world, where there was much more, I would say, much stronger gatekeeping roles than exists today. At the same time, most of the empirical literature suggests that people are actually exposed to more and different kinds of information on social media platforms than they would have been otherwise in only an era of mass media. So I think, people like Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg are unbelievably powerful at creating broad frameworks for what types of speech should happen on their platforms. I also think that we've seen all sorts of new forms of information sharing and dissemination on those platforms as well. But I also don't think that they have massive amounts of agency to control the public sphere much more broadly. And I think in every one of these Twitter examples, the irony is that even if Twitter fact checks the president's tweets, it's still running on the nightly news, and it's still discussed in the space of opinion on partisan media shows and written about on Vox and hundreds of other media sites and the New York Times. So everything the president does on Twitter just radiates everywhere through a vast and deeply hybrid media system. Where I do think that, even though Facebook is an important piece of that media system, it's not the whole system. And that we've seen much more distribution, I would ultimately say, in communications power across a vast array of very different types of media actors than have existed in previous times, particularly during the mass broadcast era in American history.
I just want to jump onto that to add, I have some work that I've done with Regina Lawrence at the University of Oregon, and we looked at the first year of Trump's tweets, and 75% of them are embedded in a news story, at least one news story. So the amplification of that, even when there's a correction, even if the story is itself a correction or a reaction, almost all the time, the actual tweet with his likeness, with his sort of signature punctuation and capitalization, with the retweets, with the likes, with the ability for the reader to like the tweet without leaving the news site. That's incredible, right? I mean, if we compare that to the reach that even Donald Trump's Twitter following would have, then it being amplified out across hundreds of news outlets every time he tweets is another, I think, sort of way that we should be thinking about, sort of, if we're worried about the impacts or effects of these sorts of tweets, it's not just on Twitter, right? I mean, it's echoing throughout the sort of very mainstream media atmosphere as well.
And just to build off that real quickly, I mean, Trump understands this.
Yeah.
I mean, he's provoking the platforms, I think, very deliberately, because he wants to stoke controversy, because that then amplifies that message, that fundamental message, primarily playing to white and Republican voters, that there's going to be massive amounts of voter fraud, and therefore you should distrust both the process of voting and the potential results this November. That's what he's doing right now. And every time he provokes the platforms, whether they leave it up or whether they take it down, either way, the entire media system is focused on writing about this and talking about it and discussing it. So what is it doing? It's putting voter fraud and making that salient in the minds of particularly Republican and particularly white voters. And I think this is a very deliberate strategy. I think that the Trump team will just go further and further with this as a means of provoking platforms, potentially getting them to act, or even if they don't act, people are going to be writing it and people are going to be paying attention about it. And at the end of the day, all he needs to do is cast doubt on an election. That's the strategy, because he's acting in an anti-democratic manner. And what he wants to do is delegitimize the vote and the potential results of that election come November.
So far, our discussion has focused really exclusively on two platforms, on Twitter and on Facebook. And I think often when we talk about content moderation policies, they are the focal point. But there are other players out there. In particular, there's Google and YouTube, right? Google writ large because of its advertising policies, and YouTube obviously because of both ads and the actual content on the platform. So two related questions for the both of you. Where do Google and YouTube fit within this broader context? And second, how have the companies done such a good job of keeping themselves out of these very discussions, sort of, staying under the radar and not being the direct object of our never-ending criticism?
Yeah, so I mean, just real briefly on your first question, it's undoubtedly true that companies like YouTube, Snapchat, for instance, also have very similar policies against things like election misinformation on the books. Enforcement is always a big question. In fact, this is the big black hole for all of these companies, is that we just have no systematic data whatsoever on being able to understand how they are enforcing, when they're making decisions, how much content they're pulling down. There's no public accounting for that whatsoever. Oftentimes it's filtered through AI and other algorithmic forms that are just not very transparent to the public. But all the stated policies, for instance, on YouTube, says that election misinformation and disinformation, regardless of who the actor is deeply problematic. Now, in terms of why they've received less scrutiny, I think for two really big reasons. So the first is that Google's kind of in a different category, right? It's about search, and it's about which pages are showing up in the context of search. So when the president is putting messages out there, right? Sure, you're going to be able to Google for what the president said about X, Y, or Z, but he's not posting to Google directly in the same way that he's posting to Facebook and he's posting to Twitter. And I think that's why in the immediate sort of public discussion, it's these two platforms that have received the lion's share of attention. For YouTube, I think you see like a lot of potential policies flare up around things like what sorts of misinformation is on the platform, what sorts of hate speech is on the platform, maybe political ads that Team Trump might have issued on YouTube, sort of drawing scrutiny, et cetera. But again, it's not the president going and directly speaking to supporters in a clear and very packaged way on YouTube on a regular basis. So I think that's why the conversation has really been dominated by Facebook and Twitter, because every time the president has been speaking, it goes on both platforms as a post. It's immediately accessible to journalists and the public. It gets millions of shares and discussion and forms of discussion around it, and it sets the tone. Everything else is a little like maybe one step removed from that immediacy.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also think that one of the reasons that YouTube in particular has been able to stay out of the fray is because even if it's a campaign video, right, it's like more produced, whereas there does seem to be this straight line, right, from the president's brain to his Twitter account, which then gets posted on Facebook. And that's just frankly more compelling, right? And seems more like this is the president speaking than does a campaign ad, that's produced and posted on YouTube. Which are then, of course, by the way, shared on Twitter and Facebook as well, right? But I think Daniel's right that it's not only one step removed, but it also doesn't seem to draw the same direct line that I think makes the Twitter content, frankly, so compelling, to journalists, even when it's not necessarily as newsworthy as undermining our faith in democratic institutions.
So one of the distinctions that's really key in all of the content moderation policies is that between political versus non-political content. Last year, Facebook announced, as Daniel was pointing out earlier, that they would not be fact-checking political advertisements, particularly campaign advertisements. Then Twitter responded by saying they were simply going to get rid of political advertisements, and actually Google followed suit. How is it that you see the platforms actually making this distinction between the political versus non-political content, and are they getting it anywhere near right?
No, it's a mess. So the other report that my team recently issued at the beginning of the year was just looking into what are the definitions of political across all the major platforms. And from that definition, how does that then change what you're allowed to advertise around, what makes its way into an ad transparency database, for instance, what micro-targeting tools can you use, et cetera. The basic takeaway is this: every platform defines political in very different ways. Google follows a much more narrow definition that is the one embraced by the Federal Election Commission, which is it's about electioneering communication. So the things that campaign committees or social issue committees, et cetera, in the context of a ballot, right? What are they saying as they vie for office, and then applies their political policies to them. Facebook has a much wider definition about what is political. It's basically anything relating to a cause or a social issue whatsoever. So this raises all sorts of questions, right? What requires a disclosure on a platform? What's going to make its way into an ad transparency database? How can things be targeted? What sorts of data can you use, et cetera? They just look very different in very different places. I would say we have a few, there's extremes, and everyone kind of gets it wrong. So Twitter, for instance, very famously banned all political speech, as you mentioned, Rebecca. To me, this is just an inane policy that gets it wrong on every level. Basically, what they do is reward people like Donald Trump with his vast organic followings, who's also going to say the most extreme things, because Donald Trump never needs to run an ad ever on Twitter. He tweets something out and everybody sees it. Who does it hurt? It hurts people like Joe Biden, who doesn't have a huge digital reach. It hurts challengers to incumbents, as opposed to those people who are already well established. It also hurts social issues and social causes compared to commercial advertisers that those causes might be directed against. So BP, right, can run all sorts of ads promoting its fossil fuels, right? Meanwhile, if you're a climate change organization, you can't run ads that critique BP, because that would be considered to be political. So Twitter is just incoherent and wrong on this in every way, shape, and form. I think Facebook gets it a little better to say that we're going to have both a broader definition of political and therefore be over-inclusive about what shows up in our ads database and the like. However, I also think they get it wrong in other ways, which is they don't deal with counter speech all that well. So you can use, for instance, Facebook's very sophisticated political advertising tools to speak to very small niches of voters. However, if you're a rival to a campaign that's using those tools, there's no way you could purchase the same audience. There's no way that you can show messages to the same audience. So the problem with Facebook is that they don't allow counter speech very well. And they don't do so in a way that I think accords with how most people would expect good democratic practice to go is that you should be able to meet speech with counter speech in the course of an election. Facebook's own algorithmic systems, their ad auctions, very consistently sort of work against counter speech. So they don't quite get it right either. Google's somewhere in the middle. They draw all sorts of arbitrary lines about what sorts of actor is going to engage in what sorts of tools. And I think the fundamental problem with Google is that they tried to ban things like, for instance, Donald Trump running very targeted ads, for instance, at those with the most extreme immigration views that use rhetoric like invasion. But it's those same tools that enable the NAACP to register black voters in the course of an election, right? So if you were to get rid of all those tools as Google has done, I think you're throwing out lots of good uses of those tools along with lots of reprehensible uses of those tools. So I think that there needs to be more happy mediums. And I think, frankly, everyone gets aspects of it wrong.
Yes. That's true. That's my contribution to that. No, and I would say, just to like go add on a little bit to it, in particular at Facebook, you know, and we've talked about this a lot, this idea of counter speech, they're not even set up in a way to be able to provide it, right? So the most powerful tools of the custom audiences and the lookalike audiences, Facebook doesn't even set it up that they know who those audiences are, so they can't even necessarily make it available. And then you know, to someone for counter speech, and then you layer in this sort of ad auction system, which has also been described as sort of non-transparent even internally. And then so there's not even a system in place where it would be easy to implement counter speech the way that they have the targeting practices set up. And I think that's really problematic too, because that's what's so powerful.
So one quick point of clarification, as we moved into the discussion of advertising in particular, you both talked about micro-targeting, custom audiences, and lookalike audiences. Would one of you mind, just for members of our audience who aren't familiar with those particular terms, explain pretty quickly for us what exactly you're talking about there?
Yes, so micro-targeting, I don't know if there's like a very specific definition, but it would just be the targeting of people along what we might consider micro features of ourselves. So not just our gender and our race and our sexual orientation, but the type of car I drive, you know, in the sort of rural or urban neighborhood I live in, you know, my entertainment preferences, those things would be micro-targeting. Lookalike audiences, well, I think it makes sense to start with custom audiences. Custom audiences is a tool that allows someone to upload a list of voters or people and match and target advertising just to those people. The lookalike tool allows you to take that list and sort of find people just like it, you know, so to sort of expand your reach along the lines that you have already defined. I hope that was quick.
Thank you. That was good. That was perfect. So last, we just have a few minutes left. So the last thing that I would like to ask each of you is essentially, what's your take-home message for our audience? Is there anything that you think we've skipped over today that isn't part of the broader public discussion that you would really like people to be thinking about? And or what's the main thing that you would like the members of our audience, our attendees, to take away from this and potentially use in their discussions about these platform policies in the future?
I had the first word earlier, so go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, to me, the big take-home message is that I think election mis and disinformation is the highest priority category of speech in a democracy that platforms should protect. I think this is an easy call for them. I think this speech that's designed to limit voter turnout and voter participation is low-value speech. And I think platforms should consistently enforce their existing policies against election mis and disinformation. And I would say for audiences, I mean, be vocal about it. I think companies are sensitive to external pressure. I think that looking to hold them accountable for their failure to enforce policies, particularly among the powerful, is an important thing that we can all do. And to Shannon's point, right, election mis and disinformation disproportionately affects people of color. We've seen this throughout the US history. It is very clear this is part of what the president is trying to do. He's also trying to raise doubts about the legitimacy of the election in the minds of white voters. And I think that all of us have a responsibility to push against that.
Yeah, and I think that I agree. I mean, I think that's the biggest takeaway. And so I would just say, you know, to be vocal about it and also to be mindful about the amplification of it, right? So is the press correcting these misinformation tweets, but also embedding them? I would say that's a really problematic practice that we should be challenging right now, because it's still, even though if there's a larger correction, there's this visual image of the tweet full of voter suppression information, racist at times, right, embedded in the story as well. And so I think there's a role beyond the platforms for the press to play in thinking about how they package this information as well.
So I want to thank both of you for taking the time today to join us, to be part of our IDDP summer webinar series, and for sharing your knowledge and reflections on what is clearly an incredibly important topic over the next few months and well beyond that in American and international politics as well. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, Rebecca.
That's great.